Okay, so this is, there we go, very important. So this is the final sort of opening installment of lecture material. And whereas for our previous conversations, we have gone through some of the other components. Here we're going to end on something that is in some ways considerably harder to access and more esoteric, if you can believe it, which is this particular lecture is devoted to an introduction to the self. Now, I want to emphasize that as with much of the rest of the material that we're dealing with, there is a circumambulation. So as we make successive passes and get a deeper sense of each of the sort of individual aspects and interpretations and stuff within the Jungian model of the psyche, you're going to get a deeper and deeper appreciation for the self. But this is an attempt to sort of make a first pass within the general schema that we've been working through. Okay, so the very first thing is just to reference back. Okay, so insofar as we've gone through stuff so far, we've talked about the conscious and the unconscious. We've talked about the personal unconscious versus the collective unconscious. Okay, we did some detailings on the ego, right, which is the center of consciousness, not the center of the psyche, but the center of the conscious mind, okay, and the shadow, which is sort of everything that the ego rejects, pushes outside of itself. So it's still part of being, it's still part of the psyche, but it is rejected and to a variable degree sort of dissociated and projected, okay, into people in the environment. We talked about the persona, and the persona is the mask that you wear, or more properly, the masks that you wear, right? So it's your interface point with the outside world. And to some extent, it's the locus of your social construction, right? That which conceals and reveals. And we talked just in the very last lecture about the contrasexual soul image, or soul, the animus anima, right? And this being the inner woman within a man, or the inner man within a woman, it being the comparable to the persona, but facing inwards, a kind of psychopomp, right? Access to the inner world. Okay, so with all of that in mind, we're going to talk about the self. Now, I mean, necessarily, as we've been going, I have alluded to the self in a number of places, okay? And, you know, as I mentioned, right, Jung himself sort of indicated that although you don't want to over-schematize the process of individuation, if you wanted to think of it in terms of loose stages, right, the apprentice stage is the shadow, right? The journeyman stage is the soul, and the masterwork is the self. Okay, so what is the self? Let me recap a couple of the metaphors and things that I've already used and go into general descriptions, and then we'll start talking about it with a little bit more sort of substance and see if we can skirt at it. Okay, so the self. Well, so the first counterpoint, right, and for those of you that have already read some of the Edinger book, right, you will already have some sense of this. But it is, if the ego is the center of the conscious part of the mind, the self is the center of the entire psyche. That is to say that it is the true center of the system. It's the true center of the system. Now, I already offered up the metaphor of the switch between the geocentric model of the solar system and the heliocentric model, right? So this is the switch between thinking of the Earth as the center of the solar system and for Copernicus, recognizing that the sun simplified the math in what the church called the Pythagorean model. And then, of course, you know, further to Galileo and subsequently thinking of it as the sun as the center, as the thing around which things orbit. Those of you that are familiar in passing with Einsteinian relativity will know that neither of those things is strictly speaking true, but let's not try to muddy the water excessively with relativity. The point is, okay, that regardless of how you look at it, regardless of it is the sun is the true center, or it makes the math easier, either one of those sort of aspects can be seen as a useful metaphor for what it means to come into a different relationship between the ego and the self. Okay, so the self is the true center of the psyche, and it is also described as the center and the totality. The center and the totality. Okay, what does this mean in our context? Well, again, I would reference you back to this notion of heliocentrism, right? The sun, as a body within the solar system, is pretty importantly the center and the totality. Why? Because it is, of course, the central mass around which all of the other orbits of the system basically are inscribed, right? So, you know, to the extent that the other planets are going around, they are going around the sun, moons notwithstanding, right? But the point is that it is sort of the point at which you get, you know, that orbital centrality, right? That things can be sort of neatly arranged in a series of concentric orbits around. Okay, so it is the center of the system. And it's also the center of the system. Well, no, actually, so it's the center of the system. It is also the totality of the system. What does that mean? Okay, well, so if we're thinking about it as in this this heliocentric sense, right? The sun as the center of the solar system. What you have to do is just imagine what would happen if the sun vanished. If the sun suddenly was, you know, gone, what happens? And the answer is all the other planets they just drift out into space, right? The sky instantly goes dark within 7 minutes or something. I'm sure everything on Earth is dead. Well, I don't know, actually. I'm not sure how much residual heat the Earth would retain, but I think we would not last very long. And all the various planets would just sail off into the depths of space, right? The whole reason that we are in, comparatively speaking, stable orbits is because of the sun's gravity well. The solar system as a system, so the solar system as a system only exists because of the gravity well of the sun. And the solar system as a kind of dynamic living system, right, especially on Earth, also only exists because of the sun, not merely because of the point of gravity, but because of the point of radiance, right? The sun, ultimately speaking, is the source of the majority of the energy in the system. It sort of radiates, right? It does radiate, literally, out from the center of the sun. If you think about the self in these terms, you know, the self is, in some sense, the radiant center of all libido within the Jungian psyche, right? It likewise is the sort of the true center of the system, not the ego. So everything else is in orbit around the self, but it is also the totality. And in a way, the Jungian notion of the self is the totality in a far more intimate sense even than the sun is. The idea is that that the self is both the center of the system, but also in some important way it, right? Everything is kind of a part of it. So, okay. Unlike the sun, very importantly, the self, generally speaking, is not obvious, at least not in ordinary states of consciousness. So much so, in fact, that, right, this is how the ego manages to carry its general delusion that it's in charge, that it is, as I like to say, the boss of this meal, right? So the ego gets very caught up because it is the center of consciousness. And again, you know, I said this before, but I want to really reiterate that that does give it a place of very special importance, right? So the ego and consciousness have unique properties. And this is one of these distinguishing points with certain kinds of other systems, right? There are some systems where sort of ego is the enemy, or ego is a thing to be dissolved, or ego is a thing to be destroyed, or ego, right? And obviously, right, people take various levels of sort of metaphysical, concreteness or bluntness around what that statement means. But within the system of Jungian psychology, it's not precisely that the ego is the enemy or that it needs to be destroyed. Rather, it is the case that it is the ego's relationship to the rest of the system, which requires sort of significant overhaul, significant alteration. And when we're considering that in terms of this heliocentric system, you know, one of the reasons that I like that particular metaphor for the shift is that it does tend to sort of underline that the primary issue is an issue of confusion, right? As long as the ego believes that it is at the center of the system, that it's the boss of this meal, right? It's going to continue to be puzzled by the fact that it seems like the orbits of the other, sort of bodies within the system, right? The wandering stars, the planets, the other archetypes, don't seem to behave in predictable ways. And they behave in predictable ways relative to the self, but not in the same sense relative to the ego, right? They go forwards, they go backwards. It's confusing, right? Never mind questions of them, failing to sort of obey the ego's will, right? The ego gets these very strong ideas about things, and they almost never pan out. So, okay, so then Jungian individuation is in some overarching sense about this alteration between the ego and the self. And that's in many cases mediated by the other archetypes and encounters with the other archetypes. Well, why? Well, one of the reasons is that the encounters with the other archetypes serve to sort of radically unseat the ego from its sense of primacy, right? To radically unseat the ego from its sense of primacy. Well, what do we mean by that? So if we want to call back to the psychodynamic hypothesis in general, I mean, if you think you are not a singular unit of being. Well, what does that mean in practice? What it means is that all kinds of things in your mind aren't under your control, right? You, the ego, you, consciousness, okay? Anybody that's sat on the meditation pillow, right, has very rapidly come into confrontation with this fact, right? You may think that you are, reasonably in control of your own mind and powers of concentration, and you might even have a beginner's luck effect the first time that you sit on the pillow. But thereafter, what you discover is like your monkey mind is just absolutely batshit crawling the walls. It's all over the place. It's sort of radically out of control. And the more you attempt to focus in on your sort of cognitive abilities for focus and concentration and imagination, the more it becomes apparent, in a sense, that there are, sort of massive gaps in your ability to actually exert control on those things. It's not that you have none. It's just that your control tends to be, comparatively speaking, sort of short or limited, right? And other factors that are seemingly emerge from outside your consciousness, right, are sort of, relatively speaking, intrusive, right? So you, the ego, the consciousness, may be deciding to do one thing, and then all of a sudden something else breaks through, right? And it suddenly reveals to you that, it's like you don't have the kind of control that you thought you had. Now, usually, initially, and I think this depends to a certain extent on people's sort of general degree of openness, to sort of reference Big Five. I think if you're highly open, then coming to that realization, the blow is softened a little bit because it's easier to approach the situation with curiosity. But but that's not invariably the case. You can be quite high openness and still, frankly, find the experience disturbing and distressing. Realizing that you aren't in control of your own mind, I mean, think about it for a second. It's this recognition that, like, if you have been operating on the assumption that you are sort of in the driver's seat, and suddenly you have a really stark demonstration of the fact that there are other forces and factors that have their own interests, seemingly their own perceptions, their own commentaries. Now, as I pointed out, I think that with a modicum of reflection, it's actually obvious, but we're sort of resistant to it, right? It still hits us, I think, with a lot of force when we recognize it. And for people for whom that's a real sort of novel experience, or who don't experience curiosity around it, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. It's like a recognition that you are, in some sense, possessed. You're out of control, right? Now, in a sense, if you want to think about it this way, the individuation process is, in fact, in a large part, about recognizing that you're not in control. You're not in control. You have some control over some things. You have a voice, right? But you're very far from calling the shots about what's happening, in general. And for many people, that's an intolerable state of affairs, okay? So any kind of encounter with these other forces, your complexes, and thus by extension, sort of archetypal forces that break through, Durchbruch, to borrow the term, that break through to you is itself a kind of a humbling shock. But when you make a close approach to the self, it's a kind of almost disastrously humbling experience for the ego. Okay, well, why is that? So we've skirted around this material too, but in a very important sense, the experience of the self is a fundamentally sacred experience. And I say that with the full weight of that word, while peeling it apart maybe from traditional religious association. Okay, so it is a kind of divine experience, right? Encounters with the self have a powerful mystical character to them. Now, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, okay, let's just come straight at this. Jung had a really interesting, in my opinion, a really interesting argument about the existence of God and how this stuff figures in. And it basically runs like this. The existence or non-existence of God, okay? The existence or non-existence of God, the existence and non-existence of higher reality, or whatever you want to call it, okay, is not, it's not accessible in any sort of standard philosophical sense. It's not epistemologically accessible to us. There is no kind of information or experience that can prove or disprove the existence of God. Now, if you happen to be powerfully on one side of that aisle or the other, then I'm sure that you're very familiar with this, right? And there are, of course, sets of arguments around this. People who are strongly atheist may say, well, like it's an extraordinary claim, and so it requires extraordinary evidence, right? So the onus is on people to show that there is some kind of higher power. And the people on the other side may be like, well, minimally, this provides some kind of explanation for creation and experience, and we don't see anything of that ilk on the other side, right? And the point is, that debate rages and rages because it's not actually epistemologically resolvable. Right? There's no experience, there's no information, there's no logical proof that you can offer that's going to finally resolve the argument. If you're a hardcore atheist and the sky cracks open and, God himself leans out and says, hey, I exist, that isn't necessarily going to convince you. You're going to decide, oh, I guess I had some LSD in my drinking water, or I had a microstroke, or there was a small seismic event that triggered micro seizures in my temporal lobe, or whatever you're going to decide. Likewise, right? You could get a wildly convincing, I don't know what a wildly convincing disproof for the existence of God is. Typically it leans on sort of problems of evil, right? Or sort of, general issues like poking holes in design. So, the absurd, weird, blind ends that evolution comes up with, right? And there are, I mean, there's some really bad ones that evolution has come up with, the hip ratio in human females is a terrible design, right? And it's compromise. Lots of things about humans are compromises, but it's a compromise, right? So quadrupeds have no problems giving birth, right? Horse, whatever, has no problems giving birth. Humans are running this weird line, and like an hour after a horse gives birth, the foal is running around. Why? Because it's basically finished. It just needs to continue growing from there. Humans are born as helpless blobs, right? They can't do anything. They can't focus their own eyes. They can't, right? They can't move under their own power. They can't eat without assistance, right? And that's because we have this monster-sized head. And, as much, of course, as every mother in the world, mine included, has complained about how the size of a baby's head interfaces with the size of the birth canal, nevertheless, the head could be considerably bigger, right? So, there's this evolutionary trade-off going on, which says that, we have to get the baby as big as possible, but this is also competing against walking upright. And walking upright, unfortunately, has a totally different structure. If your hips are super wide, walking upright becomes a real problem. So there's this evolutionary trade-off. And that evolutionary trade-off that means that in, pre-modern, periods, right, before modern medicine is relatively widespread, the death rate in childbirth is remarkably high. Now, people point at this and it's like, well, one good solution, if it's like, let's say that you are God and you are creating everything, put in a door, right? Simple. Just put in a hatch, put in a door right in the front. And there we go. There's one reasonably good solution. Likewise, right? Another classic here is humans, more than virtually any other animal, are prone to choking. And why is this? Because we share the same pipe for breathing and for swallowing, and we do lots of complex stuff with breathing because speech, right? And one really good way that you could solve that problem is just have two tubes, right? Just have two tubes, one for food, one for air, problem solved. Have them run side by side, right? But of course, that isn't what evolution chose. And so, if you're really hardcore, you're like, what the hell? Is God just cruel? Is he an idiot? What's the situation? Now, if you happen to be a believer, none of that's really going to make an impact on you in any strong way. And the fact is that philosophically, it doesn't actually address the question. It knocks out specific claims, right? But it doesn't knock out the sort of possibility, right? The general possibility that there may be a higher reality. And basically no argument can. So Jung's point is, you can't resolve this question through argument. But, and this is where I think his position is really interesting. What he says is basically, while this question cannot be resolved in terms of the actual existence or non-existence, right, the metaphysical status of God, what can be determined, right, through observation and evidence and data gathering is that humans have these experiences, that humans have these encounters. So it's just a matter of, I mean, I guess you could believe everybody was lying, but that doesn't seem to provide a particularly good explanation for it, right? The point is that people have these experiences, they have these encounters, right? And you see these all over. I mean, mystical experiences and mystical encounters with higher worlds and encounters with higher beings are a feature of basically every religious system, but not just that, because Jung also branches out to include things that are sort of distinctly secular. So for instance, right, he has an interesting chapter on UFOs. And, that was an early phenomenon back in his day. But the point is, he looks at the saucer shape of the UFO and he sees in it a fiery mandala. And other people have made these kinds of links, right? Famously, you can get a whole list of the, ancient angels were aliens people. Who believe that, the wheels of fire described in the Bible and stuff, well, that's really flying saucers. And Jung's move is to transcend both of those categories. He says, no, look, angels and flying saucers and a whole variety of other things, right, are all kind of manifestations of an encounter with this part of the psyche, right? So these kinds of experiences, he's like, they're just an empirical fact that people have them, the fact of them. And on top of that, okay, it's not just that these encounters are just like a strange one-off. These encounters are radically transformative. When people have these encounters, they change, right? They experience metanoia, change, real change. So having a mystical encounter is often the most significant thing that happens in a person's life. And it can utterly, utterly alter their orientation, their belief system, right? So Jung says, like, look, it's a given that these things happen. Now, we don't have to commit to the metaphysical existence of a god or gods or any divine principle in order to acknowledge that there is clearly a psychic component of the mind, that people do phenomenologically have these experiences. And his point is that given that that's the case, then let's look at what sorts of effects those experiences actually produce. How do they land in people's lives? And the point is that they're tremendously transformative. They're tremendously meaning producing, right? And that blocking oneself off from them seems to rob human experience of a very important dimension, right? There are some sort of configurations of life and personality that seem like they are just complete brick walls until one of these experiences happen. And so it's noteworthy, right, that Alcoholics Anonymous is fundamentally predicated on experiences of these kind. And I think I mentioned this, right? But the guy who founded Alcoholics Anonymous was in contact with Jung. And Jung essentially said, like, look, it's what's required is an encounter with God. Now, that gets read often in a very literal way, okay, by certain kinds of interpreters. but the point is, like, what's Jung talking about when he's talking about God? And what he's talking about is, in some very important sense, the self. Now, one question, that emerges from that is like, okay, so, but does that really mean that we have to, like, is this the only way to interact with the self, with sort of, weirdness and mumbo jumbo? Like, could we not get an interaction going that's a little bit closer to the sensible world of the ego? And the answer is no. No. Because of what the nature of what the self is, right? Because the self is the center of the system, it's also the meaning maker. And it's something that importantly, okay, transcends opposites. Where the ego exists in a world which in very real sense has a jagged split, right? Where things are parsed out into opposites all day long. The self exists in a transcendent space, right? In some, right, metaphorically transcendent space. In a transcendent space, it has, in some very real sense, it embodies and transcends all opposites because it contains all of the potential and all of the actuality, right? That is the psyche. Like, it's all kind of there. So, when the ego moves in a certain direction, right? I'm a very punctual person, right? The self contains both of those things. It contains punctuality and it contains, right, sort of, I don't know, laissez-faire timing, chronic lateness. What's the polite counterpoint? I got to think about that. Because it contains sort of within it all opposites, it necessarily appears to us as being mixed and paradoxical, right? So that's one thing. Two, and again, take this specific word to be somewhat metaphorical, but it massively outweighs the ego. It's a much bigger overall structure than the ego is, right? The ego, in a way, is like a small spotlight, or it's a flickering scrap of consciousness, right? It's got a very high opinion of itself. But the fact is that it is a relatively small overall thing. Whereas the self is this kind of massive organizing principle. It's just so much bigger than the ego. So everything that it has to say, minimally needs to be geared down so that the ego can even catch it, right? But just to encounter sort of the edge of this thing is to encounter something in one's mind that is so much bigger and so much more significant in some important sense, right? And I mean, I'll tell you, one of the ways that I think about this, and having talked to people, I know some of you know this, but I'm not an Orthodox Vervaekean, but I'm a student and friend of John Vervaeke's. And so we've had, for those of you that are familiar with this, many, many conversations about his concept of relevance realization, right? And the central feature of relevance realization, right, John's work points to the centrality of some mechanism within cognition that produces relevance as being a central pivot, okay, around which all other functions sort of necessarily, or upon which all other functions necessarily depend, right? So relevance realization and sort of fundamental framing are by their very nature pre-egoic, pre-syntactic, pre-semantic, right? They have all the pre-categorical, right? It exists in this background. It is the process upon which all of the other structuring processes of consciousness and cognition depend. And so I sometimes think of the self as being sort of co-equal with that. That self, in that sense, is this kind of thing which is behind all of the other properties, right? Without which not, those properties don't exist. And so in that sense, it's behind and above language. It's behind and above syntax and semantics, meaning. It's behind and above, right? The ego itself. It's behind and above the basic categorical framings of the world. And that's not just in terms of opposites, but like category in general, right? Your ability to see things categorically, which, if you think about it, is also part of the fundamental feature that produces type, right? Archetypes in some sense, right? It's typological, it's categorical. Given that it is the thing that is behind that, it's deep and it's old, right? It precedes human consciousness. It is a function that we would expect to be in its essence sort of invariable between species. And so it would reach back to the very earliest instances of what we would think of as life, right? insofar life is sort of autopoetic, self-making, right? Then relevance, in some sense, goes that far back. And so I don't know if I would think of them as equal, but I often think of them as certainly bearing some very close resemblance, right? This kind of concept of relevance realization that John has and the self, right? Because the self also it does all of those things, right? And like an important thing to consider in this is that if you take it as a given that there is some feature, some process in your mind which produces all of these things that your consciousness is not producing itself, then you don't have to have a religious bent per se to recognize that thing is the creator of the universe. Not maybe the entire universe, but it's the creator of your universe, the only universe you will ever experience. Now, without getting solipsistic, right? Without sort of folding yourself into the, oh my God, is anybody else real? And it seems like there are reasons to think that they are, although, you know, as you know, if you study philosophy, that's a complex question. But the point is, like, look, your mind is all you're going to experience, period. I mean, this is a given, right? You're never directly experiencing the world. You're never directly experiencing, so far as we know, other people's mental events. What you experience is your own mind. You're experiencing your own mind. That is what you are experiencing. And maybe there are interface points to an objective world, but the point is that is the actual locus of your experience. Which means, right, that if there is a process, if there is a function, if there is a dynamic in there that is sort of responsible at the large scale for, right, the general organizing dynamic of your experience, it's the self. And effectively speaking, it creates everything you see, right? Everything you are. Everything you care about. Your very sense of the structure of being. And the thing about mystical experience and altered states, okay, that's sort of useful in this regard is that altered states and mystical experiences, okay, and I don't simply mean here psychedelic states, although I think those are perfectly valid mystical states and altered states for the purpose of study, but there are lots and lots and lots of ways that cultures can get into these places, and we have a lot of variability just naturally as human beings. What those things do us is what they do for us is that they show us the tremendous variability of our experience, right? When somebody has a powerful altered state, one of the things that is often so striking about it to them is that it's this sense that like it's accessible, that there are other modes and means of being. You can feel so differently about yourself, that the world can seem so radically different, that things can be obvious or inaccessible, right? That things can stand out, that they can be foregrounded or backgrounded, that emotional states can vary so wildly and powerfully, and that they can be combined together in ways that we might not otherwise anticipate. And indeed they can, right? Emotions are, you know, an interesting dynamic field. And although there are, it seems, certain kinds of primary emotions in the human system, right? Those emotions can be combined together in a variety of sort of shades and nuances, like music notes or colors on a palette, right? A thing that I sometimes say is, given the combinatorial space of emotions, and especially where emotion connects up with conceptual cognition, there are emotions that are accessible to human beings that have never yet been experienced. Think about that for a second. There are new emotions waiting to be discovered. And that to me just seems like a very natural outgrowth of what is a huge combinatorial possibility space, right? Okay, so various states of consciousness and things reveal to you how variable the space can be. If you're sort of not familiar with that, you can just check in with the altered states that you experience on, you know, a day-to-day basis without any kind of psychotechnological or chemical intervention or anything. And your experience of the world is wildly different depending on your mood, depending on, right, obviously your health, right? So if you're in a state of fever or something, it's an extremely unpleasant altered state, but a striking one. You know, obviously there are a variety of things that can interfere with your consciousness in ways because it interferes with your health. But just considering for a second your, you know, your mood, your state of attention, right, and so on and so forth. These things can extremely powerfully alter your sense of the world. Indeed, okay, it's the case that, as I mentioned, the ancients tended to think of very strong emotions as being, sort of coextensive with the gods, right? If you were falling in love, you were possessed by a god. If you were, filled with rage, you were possessed by a god. And a big part of that, okay, squarely emerges from this fact that it alters your salience landscape in such a powerful fashion to be in an altered state. And, virtually all of us have been there, right? If you have been in a state where you are falling in love, but you don't know the situation around it, you will go through wild highs and lows, right? Oh my God, they didn't answer my text, plunge, right? Or, oh, they talked to me outside my locker. Does anybody have lockers anymore? You just watch me cast myself back to high school. You're right, I'm soaring. And the point is that degree of variability also affects the way that you see other things, right? When you are depressed, you literally detect colors less well. Everything perceptually for you becomes grayer. Like it has that level of impact on your perception, right? Food will often not be good, right? It's if you're seriously depressed, you're anhedonic. So pleasures cease to be pleasurable. And importantly, really importantly, right, your sense of self becomes highly distorted, right? You may start reflecting back negative images, views, memories, right? So your ability to get at your sense of who you are changes quite radically. And your sense of possibility changes. So if you're depressed, your sense of possibility just narrows, right? And if you've talked to somebody who's seriously depressed, often they're like, no, that won't work. That won't work. Nothing will work. There's nothing I can do. I've tried everything and nothing will work. Well, that precise line, that's what it feels like. I have no small experience with depression, and that is what it feels like. It feels constrained. Another thing that I often track, actually, which is sort of interesting in this regard, I've learned over the years that one of the early markers, the early warning markers that I can sort of pay attention to relative to my own depressive states is boredom. So it's a small set of steps for me, okay? It goes like this. Day one, I'm bored. And frankly, I'm not often bored. I have a lot of interests and I consider a lot of things interesting, and I tend to be involved in many, many different projects of many sorts with lots of different people. And I have independent projects, and I'm a busy guy, and I have a lot of interests, and always have. But if I don't have a project, if I feel like I don't have a project broadly construed, that could be a hobby, it could be whatever, that I'm connecting to. And don't get me wrong, sometimes I have veg down days like anybody where I just want to like eat, dip and binge watch things, right? If I'm exhausted. But the point is, right, that represents a relatively low energy state. And if I'm straight up bored, I don't want to watch anything actually. I don't want to do any of my projects. And like I go through Netflix, I watch 5 minutes of this, 5 minutes of that, 5 minutes of this. That's the danger zone, right? Because at that point, it's a short set of steps from I'm bored to nothing is interesting. None of my projects are interesting. To nothing at all is interesting. Everything seems flat. To everything seems meaningless. To life is meaningless, right? Or just like seems like there's no point to anything. Now, if you think about that for a second, what is that? It's like a flattening. It's a flattening, right, of the world. Nothing stands out. Nothing excites. There seems to be no possibility. There's no magic. There's no through line of potential. So everything is just flat. And without those things, very often I will find my attention starting to fold in on myself in a very bad way, right? Where I'll begin to, be concerned about the quality of my life. And in that state, often it's like, is this inescapable? Is this all there is, right? Which is patently false. If you've been depressed, you've probably been not depressed. These things don't last forever, but that can be very hard to see from the inside. Like it took me quite a few years of experience to just be able to like tolerate it like weather, right? And a lot of that is just, again, it's like just a built up body of dipping under and coming back out and dipping under and coming back out. And sometimes it's bad. So any of these states, love, powerful states of anger, right? Likewise, anger is so clarifying and motivating, right? Given the choice between being sad and being angry, most people would choose to be angry. Anger burns faster, in a sense, like the emotion tends to run through faster, and it's clarifying. It invites action. When you're seriously sad, you're just like, I don't want to do anything. When you're angry, on the other hand, the world splits into nice, clean categories. I'm right, you're wrong. This is what you did. This is to blame. I'm pissed off, right? It motivates you to action to get whatever the obstacle is out of the way, but it also beautifully clarifies things. Of course, it oversimplifies them, right? Anger, we tend to lose nuance. It's very hard to process nuance if you're extremely angry, which incidentally is why you should basically never argue when you're angry, in my opinion. If you're angry, that's not actually the time to have the argument, because you can't think clearly, or barely. Maybe if you have like a really well worked out pre-grievance, but I think you'll typically find that actually you don't do a particularly good job of either arguing or negotiating during that state, especially if you're actually taking it up with somebody else. Okay, so, but what's the other thing about anger? It's kind of gross, I think, after the fact. Some people will just keep their anger going forever if they can, so that, right, they'll just keep stoking it to keep that clarity running. But for the most part, for most of us, it cools down. And the metaphor that I often use for this, which doesn't work for everybody, but if you happen to eat bacon, when you cook bacon in a pan, you end up with all this bacon fat, right? And bacon fat, while it's hot, is delicious, right? It's wonderful stuff. It's like you can cook with it or whatever. It's clear and it's tasty and it's hot, right? But the second it cools down, it's disgusting. It's like white and opaque and sticky. And it's just like nasty, right? I mean, in general, you can carry this metaphor if you think about any time that you were like super, super excited about a meal before, and then you thought you were going to gag when you looked at the meal afterwards because you were like, you're too full, right? Anger is a bit like that. Once it cools down, it's like, ugh, like it just doesn't feel good, which is why I typically recommend people don't whip themselves up. But sometimes it's a useful escape from sadness. I'll be honest, I not infrequently as a younger man would use certain kinds of musical albums to catalyze anger, right? To whip my anger up if I was feeling really sad, as a way of sort of lighting it on fire, burning my way through, and then I would get, past it. You could burn through your sadness with anger. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself with emotional psychotechnologies. The point that I'm making is this. All of those different mood states, and not even getting into exotic altered states, all radically change your perception and experience of the world. And the point is, what those differences give you is this sense that your world is contingent, it's constructed, right? The rules of reality, as you typically see them, aren't invariable. There are different modes of being, different ways, it seems, of experiencing time and space and identity and category. And there are sort of states that are really nearby, right? Altered states like dreaming. They're really nearby that play, again, with some of these rules. The categories in dreaming are blurry. They're blurry. They're odd, right? And dreams are strange. Dream logic is this concept that we have. Interesting thing, which I thought about dropping into a discussion, and I might at some point, but we're coming up on Dream Week, so it's just something to consider. Came across a thing that was like, considering how often you look at your smartphone, how often would you say it turns up in your dreams? And, when I was, apparently this first came out in a tweet a couple of years ago, but I didn't encounter it then. So I encountered it this morning, and I thought about this and I was like, yeah, that's true. I mean, like most people, of course, my smartphone is horribly, like the first thing I look at when I wake up and the last thing I look at before I go to bed. And don't get me started on that Black Mirror just yet. But the point is, like, it really is. And, it's a funny combination. I mean, if you don't have it, it's often panic-inducing initially. And if you lose your connectivity, it's like having a half-asleep limb. Like, we are really extended into our phones, right? We have a substantial identity with them. Maybe that's the thing. But the point is, they don't turn up, it seems to me, in dreams very often. I can remember dreaming about televisions and movie theaters, but I don't really remember dreaming about, about my phone ever. And interestingly, I went and looked it up, and it turns out there are, in fact, sort of percentage studies of this and some explanations for it. Anyway, I might throw that into a discussion because it's an interesting question. Okay, so the point is dreams, right next door to regular consciousness. And all of these states reveal the way in which our consciousness and our experience of the world is highly contingent and highly constructed. And behind that contingency and behind that construction is the self, where we, the ego, also are contingent and constructed. Our consciousness is not a certainty. Consciousness can go out like that. Any minor conditions, right? This is the bit I said about hold your breath, right? You can hold your breath, and you can hold your breath until you black out. And the second you black out, right? What's blacking out? Blacking out is the moment when you've reduced things to the point when consciousness goes offline. And the second consciousness goes offline, the system steps in and says, okay, we're going to take it from here, right? And the system just ups your breathing again. That's why you can't hold your breath to death, right? You can obstruct your airway, but you can't your breath to death. Right. So, you know, your consciousness is a latecomer. It develops late, relatively speaking, right? Consciousness doesn't seem to, particularly in the sense that we think of it, like conscious self-awareness, right? Consciousness doesn't seem to develop until relatively late, right? It's not hugely important to a large number of functions. It can be disrupted pretty easily. We won't get into it too much in this course, but you get funny instances like parasomnias and blind sight, where it seems like really complicated functions can occur and consciousness just isn't involved. It does a lot of taking credit for things via confabulation, and we will talk about that a little bit later, but the point is, like, it's a latecomer, and behind it, and behind all these other processes is something else. To encounter it as the self. So given those things, that the self is huge, and that the self is pre-categorical and all this jazz that I'm talking about, imagine for a second what it is like to encounter those things. Now, one thing that we know about the self is that the self speaks in symbols. Why? Well, you know, an expression goes, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. But if so, a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. Symbols, particularly in the sense that we'll deal with them in depth psych, right, are this extremely rich, they're extremely rich, deep source of meaning. A single symbol can unfold so much. It can say so much in a compressed fashion. It's a dense form of information, okay? Metaphor in and of itself is a relatively dense form of information. But where symbols are concerned, right, it has this tangled quality. And there's an important sense in which symbols are inexhaustible. You can't ever finish explicating what a symbol does, right? What it means, what it points to, what it sort of stands for, right? And symbols are the language of the self, right? Symbols, generally speaking, relate to, you're going to tend to see symbolic resonance with everything going on in the unconscious necessarily. But with the self, you're going to get these very charged symbols. So if an encounter with the self is indistinguishable from an encounter with God, then the kinds of images that you're going to get are extremely powerful divine themes, right? Creation, destruction, right? Power, awe, resurrection, right? These are big themes, great big themes, things like creation and apocalypse, right? Things like meaning and destiny, right? Sort of like time and the meaning of time, right? And the meaning of your life, right? Symbols, you know, big ones like the Grail, right? The Grail in a Christian context, right, is the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, but it took on, in the medieval period, a whole additional set of associations that it also pulled from pagan sources, and it is, you know, like this object. That's what, you know, the Knights of the Round Table, you know, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin and all that jazz, right? They go questing for the Grail, because the Grail can heal any wound and et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's this incredibly powerful, you know, locus for God's presence on earth. Well, that's a powerful symbol. And these are the sorts of things that the self often presents itself. in, right? Another really good example, you know, if you're familiar with it, is the Bhagavad Gita, right? So the Bhagavad Gita, of course, is a sub book out of the Mahabharata. It's a big Indian epic, right? Sort of, it's much bigger than, but it's comparable to some of the sort of Greek epics that we're familiar with. You know, the Trojan War and so on. So it's this sort of big epic which relates to a kind of war. The gods are involved, but it also relates to a war between sort of two closely related families. And they're meeting on the battlefield at Kurukshetra. And I apologize for my weak pronunciation to everyone for whom this is an important and meaningful text. I assure you I'm going to mispronounce things all year. Okay, so in this text in the Mahabharata, which is short and I highly recommend, you know, what's the essence of this story? Well, we get Arjuna, who is he's a noble bowman, okay? And so he's a member of one of these families, and he's driving with his charioteer, Krishna, and they're driving down the battlefield, right, at Kurukshetra, and they can see all the armies are arrayed, right, to face off against each other. And on the opposing side, he can see like his cousins and stuff. And he says to his charioteer, Krishna, he's like, I don't want to do this. Like, I know that I was born into the warrior class and stuff, but like, I just don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to kill these people, you know? Okay, so, you know, he's like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. He sits down, basically. So Krishna begins to talk to him, and he, you know, relates quite a few things. I mean, you know, he talks generally about sort of the structure of Hindu religion and the various sort of different yogas, right? Different ways of connecting to God, paths of devotion, paths of intellect, paths of concentration. So he gives sort of a tour of like religious technique of the period. But then he starts to get towards the end, and quite famously, Krishna then begins to reveal to Arjuna his divine nature, right? That he is in fact sort of God. So he sort of starts to unfold this vision, and by times it's sort of beautiful and cosmic, and you know, he's 1,000-headed and flames of creation and eternity, and right, it starts to get really cosmic, and then it becomes terrifying, and you know, there are sort of rivers of blood carrying countless warriors into Krishna's jaws, and he is destroying everything, right? And he says, and this depends on your translation, I am become death, destroyer of worlds, right? This incidentally was also famously quoted apparently by Oppenheimer, one of the designers of the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, when the bomb was detonated in Trinity, New Mexico. I am become death, destroyer of worlds, was apparently what he said when they saw the bomb go off. So, you know, here we have Krishna revealing, like, right, I am become death. Sometimes I am become time, you'll see that translation too. And his basic point is like in this cosmic aspect, right? He says like all of these men here, all these mortal men on the field have already been killed by me. Like I will devour them. And yet their souls, of course, within the system are indestructible. And then the vision stops, and Arjuna is notably horrified. But the point of this is, at this point, Krishna's like, so go out there and do your job, right? And we could have a conversation about that more broadly. But the point is, right, this moment where Arjuna has this confrontation with Krishna, where Krishna really unveils himself, tells us a little something about what such an encounter is like. It just blows Krishna's mind, right? Because it's the cosmic, but to have an encounter with something of that power is not, strictly speaking, like wonderful and lovely. It can be, but it can also be just suffused with holy terror, right? Another version of this that I quite like, that I've mentioned before, is the scene in Lord of the Rings where they offer, the hobbits offer Galadriel, the elf queen, the one ring, right? Which is sort of an ultimately corrupting ultimate power. And she says, you would gift it to me. And he's like, take it, take it, take it. And then she suddenly says, you know, she transforms and is like, instead of a dark lord, you would have a dark queen, beautiful and terrible as the sea. All who looked upon me would love me and despair. Okay, so when you get that again, that kind of like the suffusion, the revelation, right? Revelation Bearing in mind that is also the name of the last book of the New Testament, Revelations, and it has to do with apocalypse, also a word for revealing, right? The tearing away of the mundane to reveal this holy terror, right? This awe, right? The root of both awesome and awful, right? That's the kind of confrontation we're talking about when you have a close brush with the self. It crushes you, tumbling, right? It's this recognition that like, oh yeah, you're an important speck, but you are a speck. And, you know, necessarily that it's terrifying and reorienting. There's just no way that the ego walks away from something like this unchanged. And of course, recognizing that this is the real power sort of the system, the true center of the system, then radically changes your sense of who and what you are. If there is a power within your own psyche, which so massively exceeds, right, the ego, then the ego is going to necessarily reorient, right? It's going to change the way you look at your experience. It's definitely going to change the way that you look at these other kinds of encounters. Now, not everything is going to be this like blow you out of your boots encounter with the self. And indeed, there are dangers that come from these close encounters with the self, namely inflation. So for instance, a quite common syndrome, so common, in fact, that it's named after the city where it's common, is Jerusalem syndrome, if you've ever heard of this. Jerusalem syndrome is this thing that happens when people visit Jerusalem and they spontaneously decide that they are religious figures. So people will decide that they're Moses or decide that they're Jesus, or right? This happens with surprising regularity in Jerusalem. Now, you could look at that and, you know, be like, well, maybe there's something in the water, right? Or you could say, well, the kind of person who goes to Jerusalem is maybe prone to that. And perhaps both of those things are true. But there's something about people having this encounter with Jerusalem, which is a city that is quite holy in 3 of the world's major religions, right? That to have this really direct encounter in Jerusalem seems to fire something up, and suddenly their ego becomes very closely associated with the self in a specific emanation, right? The specific divine emanation. To suddenly decide that you're Jesus, right? That you are Jesus Christ represents a profound conflation, and usually a destructive one, right? When people get inflated, when they decide that they are messiahs in various ways, it's typically not great, to be honest. You know, it's typically destructive of their relationships, and more often than not, it's destructive of themselves, provided that they have the inflated I and only I, right? And it's a different thing to recognize that, like, you know, whatever, in some sense, I am tied to the heart of creation, and so are you and all of you, right? That's sort of a different thing. But when it contains itself within the ego, I am the risen Messiah. I, right? That's the ego. I am the risen Messiah. Well, then the ego is trying to contain this energy in a way that blows away the rest of the, right, normal sort of components that are in the ego, the regular personality, gone. There's a really interesting book, and I can't imagine them being able to create this now, but there's a really interesting book I read years ago, I have a couple of copies of, called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. And this book is interesting because it's, I think it took place in the 50s, might have been the early 60s, and the author, Milton Rokeach, basically he was working as a psychiatrist, I believe, might have been a psychologist, but anyway, he was working in a mental hospital at the time, a residential mental hospital. And he had 3 separate patients who all were operating under the idea that they were Christ or Jesus, with variations. They had quite different personalities, but they all believed this. And so what he did, and it's hard to imagine them being able to do anything like this in ethics now, but he put them into a group together. Like, he started doing group therapy with them and then recorded their conversations as they had these interactions, as they began to argue, debate, reconcile, right? And it's transcripts of these conversations. The first half of the book is considerably more interesting, in my opinion, than the last half, but it's still a fascinating read, because what you've got is 3 individuals, which in the depth psychological Jungian sense we're talking about, have had this close encounter with the self, trying to reconcile that with each other in some sense. Anyway, fascinating stuff. Okay, so the self. So the important thing to remember is that your the individuation process in the way that we're talking about it is about coming to some kind of new relationship with the self, where the ego steps aside and is able then to be in proper, not pushy, not exclusive relations with the other components of the psyche. Okay? That's the process of individuation. It's not about absorbing them all. It's not about dominating them all. It's not about exploding them. It's about coming into relationship with them so that the system can operate in a harmonious fashion. The ego can do the special thing that the ego needs to do, but so can everything else in the psyche, right? And recognizing that there is some fluidity there, right? That then we have the flexibility, this ability to shape change, right? To be able to operate across different worlds and to be able to transform, right? To be able to go through the metamorphosis that we need for stages of life. So that's the self.